Ruth, the book of Ruth, the advancing and preserving of the promise to the tribe of Judah. At the end of the day, that's what the book of Ruth is in the Bible for. It tells us a bunch of wonderful things. It's a great story. There's a heroine. Her name is Ruth. There's a wonderful, godly Jewish man. His name is Boaz. And what we see in the story, I say story, I'm careful to say story because somebody will say, oh, like it's a fairy tale. No. When I say story, what I mean is this actual historical event that took place is told like any other story is told when we go back into the book. I just don't have a lot of pastors will use the word account, the account of Ruth, because they think it sounds more historical, but story is not a bad word. It's just a story of a true event. It's not based on true events. It is true events when we open the book of Ruth. And what this is about is the advancing and the preserving of the promise to the tribe of Judah. Remember, this is the promise. This is what I'm talking about. What promise, Rick? The advancing and preserving of what? Which of God's promises? Because He's made thousands, if not tens of thousands in the book, if not hundreds of thousands. In Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, remember Jacob had his 12 sons in the room. He was on his deathbed, and he went son to son and prophesied about who these men would be, how their tribes would develop as they went into the promised land eventually. And this is what he said when he got to his son Judah. Judah was the son of Leah. He was the fourth born son of Jacob. And when Jacob, the father, got to his son Judah, this is what he said to him. This is the prophecy. He said, the scepter, talking about a ruler's staff, a king's staff, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. What a wonderful thing if you were that boy to hear your father say, from you, son, will come the kings of Israel. Not from Benjamin, not from Issachar, not from Naphtali, not from Manasseh, not from Ephraim, not from Dan, not from Asher, not from Levi, not from Reuben, not from Simeon. From you, Judah. From you will come the leadership of the nation Israel. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. We're talking about kings' staffs. And then he says, until this event occurs, in Judah there will be kings. The kings of Israel will come from Judah until something occurs. And this is the something, until one called Shiloh comes. Judah will be the king. Judah's tribe will come, from Judah's tribe will come the kings until the blessed day when one that God names Shiloh, when Shiloh comes, and to him Shiloh shall be the obedience of the peoples. Shiloh is this word. This is what it looks like in the Hebrew. Remember, if you don't know that Hebrew is written and read from right to left. So we see this word and we read it from the left and go this way. But when you look at this word, this is the SH, the shin, it goes this way. So this is the SH, the I, the L, the O, Shiloh, written and read from right to left. And who is this? What does this word mean? It actually has a meaning. It's not just a name like Rick, it has a meaning. And this is what the word means. This is what the title means. This one that's coming, this one that's called Shiloh, this is what it means. Remember the whole conversation, the context is Judah or Jacob telling his son Judah, from your people will come the kings. The ones that have the right to rule Israel. That's what a king does. He rules a kingdom. And it's only those from Judah who have the right to rule. But one day, one king will show up on this earth, and it's ultimately him that has the right to rule. The right to rule ultimately belongs only to Shiloh. Who is that? It's Jesus. the King of Israel, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who one day will be called the King of Kings and Lord of Lords when he returns to this earth and sits on David's throne. So Jesus has to be from which tribe? He has to be from Judah. Has to be. Or else he's not qualified to be the one to whom the right to rule belongs. If he's not from the tribe of Judah, we've got the wrong Messiah. And some religions have the wrong... I forgot to switch this. So what we see in the book of Ruth, what we see in Ruth is Yahweh showing us the family tree of Shiloh more clearly. He made the promise through Jacob in Genesis 49:10, and little by little, as the Bible continues to be written by God, little by little, as you turn the pages, He gives more information about who the deliverer would be, who is going to be the Savior. It's very important to us as Christians, as those who believe in God, it's very important to us to know who the Savior is. I mean, to have absolute 100% certainty that Jesus of Nazareth is the one that God the Father intended to save us from our sins. We have to have the right guy, or else we will die in our trespasses and sins. We've got the wrong guy if we don't know from the Bible that Jesus is the one. And so Ruth is part of that unveiling by God. Ruth is Yahweh showing us, unveiling more truth about who Messiah will be, showing us the family tree of Shiloh more clearly in the tribe of Judah, as we'll see very soon. Sorry about the spacing, drives me nuts. I forgot to look at it tonight. Yahweh will use a faithful Moabite woman. That Moabite woman is Ruth. Yahweh will use a faithful Moabite woman and a faithful Jewish man. That man's name is Boaz, as we'll see in a while. And that woman, from that woman and her marriage to this faithful Jewish man, will come the grandfather of King David. And Jesus will one day sit on David's throne, because Jesus is a great, however many greats, grandson of David. Jesus is in the line of King David. King David's family tree, if you keep going, branches and branches and branches, eventually gets to Mary and to Joseph. Even though Joseph wasn't Jesus' earthly biological father, he was also royalty in David's line. Joseph was royalty. He was of the royal family of David by lineage, by family tree, and so was Mary. Both of their lines can be traced to King David. One in Matthew chapter 1, the other in Luke chapter 3. Joseph's line is in Matthew 1, Mary's line is in Luke chapter 3. But that's what Ruth is about, to show that that promise God made, that He would send someone through the tribe of Judah to be king, that one day Shiloh would come. That's what this story is about. That God preserves that promise, that through history He preserves it, and He moves it forward and gives more information about who this man will be one day. Jesus Christ, the Jewish Messiah and Savior, is in the direct family tree of King David. So if Jesus is in the family tree of King David and this Moabite woman, Ruth, is David's great-grandmother, this story matters. This story matters in the genealogy of making absolutely sure that Jesus is from Judah and from the family of David. Jesus is Shiloh. Jesus is the king who would come to earth. He is the only one who has the right to rule both Israel. This is a very important point. He has the right to rule, and He's the only one who has the right to rule both Israel and the whole world. Both Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles. Only Jesus has been given authority and a universal kingdom to rule the whole world. There's no king of Israel, David included, who ever ruled anything other than Israel. They had rulership over some, or not rulership, but authority over some other kingdoms, but they didn't rule them. David ruled Israel. Solomon ruled Israel. And other nations who had their own kings would bring tribute to David and Solomon out of respect for Yahweh and the fact that Israel was stronger militarily. But the kings of Israel never ruled Gentiles as their king, but Jesus will. Shiloh, the one who actually has the right to rule. This is a disaster. Look at this. The promise made to I've got to read it because it's all messed up. Half of it's not there. The promise made to Judah in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, is that this tribe, his tribe, would continue being the kings of Israel until the ultimate king arrived on the earth, Jesus of Nazareth. The promise made to Judah in Genesis 49:10 is that his tribe, Judah, the families that would come from Judah would continue to be the kings of Israel until the ultimate king would arrive on earth. That's Jesus, the Messiah. Another slide, I want to show you these things too. How is the Bible laid out? I'm telling you the book of Ruth is important because of what it teaches us about Messiah and his family tree, but this is how the Bible is laid out in the first few pages in the book of Genesis. This is why we have to know who Messiah is, because God makes statements, He makes promises to us, but we have to determine, how do we know who the right Messiah is? God tells us He created the world. Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It also tells us in the first pages of the Bible, God tells us that He created man. He created Adam from the dust of the earth. This is the story. This is how God reveals Himself to mankind. I am God. I created everything. Okay, check mark. We understand. There's a higher being, an ultimately powerful being. He's the one who created the world. And then He says, I also created the first man. And we continue through the story. He tells us how He created the man. He tells us that Adam broke the one rule in the Garden of Eden and ate from the forbidden tree. We're continuing with God in the early pages of Genesis telling us what our history is, what our origins are. So now we know God created everything. We know God created mankind. We know God gave one rule to man and man broke the rule. So God continues to tell us things in the Bible. He tells us that Adam was separated from Him, separated from God as his penalty for disobedience, and that is spiritual death. We learn that in the Bible. That Adam was separated from God the moment he ate the fruit. And then we hear this from God. And this is where it starts to get tricky, because we have to be able to determine, how is it that God's going to save us? Do we have the right Savior? God promises to send someone. And at that point you say, who and when? And as you continue turning the pages of the Bible, you get to books like Genesis chapter 49, you get to books like Ruth, you get to books like 1 Samuel, and you start seeing these promises where God makes it more and more clear who that someone will be. We have to know, God has to tell us, this is Him, or else we'd have no idea. And in the Old Testament, He builds up so that when Jesus came, there was no question. That is, behold, like John said, behold the Lamb of God who has come to take away the sins of the world. That is no doubt, no question. That's the one. That's the one promised in Genesis 49. That's the son of Ruth, the great-grandchild of King David. Ruth was King David, and that man is in the family of David. There's no question that Jesus is the one. But you go all the way back into Genesis, and God promises to send someone who could pay Adam's penalty and bring Adam and his human race back, because they're separated now after the biting of the fruit, back into a harmonious, peaceful relationship with God. So we have to ask the question, how could we ever know who that someone is? If God stopped the Bible and just told us, I'll take care of this, I'll send someone to earth, how in the world would we ever know who it was? It's not enough information. we'd all have our own ideas about how and who the deliverer was. So here's the predicament of all the billions of men, because the promise was that a man would come, a male king. Of all the billions of men who've lived on earth since the days of Adam, how would we ever know which one was the deliverer? If not for God to tell us in the Bible, promise after promise, truth after truth about who Messiah would be, we just keep turning the pages and we get more information about who Messiah would be, that He would not only be a man, He would be God, He would be born of a virgin, He would be born in Bethlehem. All of these things we start to learn as we continue, as God continues to show us who the deliverer would be. So God tells us in the Bible, but you have to know this Bible to be able to guarantee yourself that we believe in the right Messiah, that we've got the right God-man, Jesus Christ. There is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. And you have to know the Bible to be able to confidently say, I will be with God forever because Jesus is the Messiah of the world. And I believe that He came to die for me. But if you've got the wrong Jesus, how pitiful. And that's why we have to know this book and know it well. So the book of Ruth, after saying all of those things, the book of Ruth is part of God's revealing to man who the Messiah is. Who the Messiah is, because it traces the lineage of King David. That's the greatness of this book, Ruth and Boaz, the grandparents of King David. Ruth chapter 1 says this. Go with me to the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 1. We're going to look at this. We're going to look at the book of Ruth for a couple of weeks. It won't take us long because there's only 4 chapters. Let's go through it and look at this story of Ruth. What's this book about? Who are these people? Ruth chapter 1 verse 1 says this. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed. So we absolutely know when the book of Ruth takes place. In the period of the book of Judges. It came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah. What was that? What tribe? Judah. A certain man of Bethlehem. Very interesting city. Bethlehem. Where Obed would be born. Where Jesse would be born. Where David would be born. Who else? Where Jesus would be born. It's a very important little book, this book of Ruth. A certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. Just to give you an idea of where we are, here's a map of Israel. This is Bethlehem right here. Bethlehem is only about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. Gives you an idea of how small Israel is, that from that dot to that dot is only 5 miles. I live 11 miles away from here in West Columbia. 5 miles is nothing. So from Jerusalem to Bethlehem is 5 miles. And this is what's going on. There's a famine in the land. But I thought if people obeyed, I thought if Israel obeyed God, that there wouldn't be a famine, that He would bring the spring rains, that all their crops would... so what if there is a famine, what's going on in Israel? Somebody tell me. Either God is blessing them for obedience or cursing them for disobedience. Is this blessing from God or cursing from God? This is cursing from God. That's why there's a famine in Israel. Something is going wrong. Remember, this is in the period of the book of Judges. I wonder which judge. Can we get an idea of which judge may have been the judge during the time in which Ruth lived? There was a famine in the land. So this is what happens, as we'll see in just a minute. This man, Abimelech, will take his wife and his 2 sons, and they will leave the promised land, cross the Jordan. I think I have a red line. There they go. Cross the Jordan River and go down into the land of the Moabites. You know what's tragic about that? In Israel, there's no food. But in Moab, land of Gentile cousins of Israel, there's plenty of food to eat. Tragic. That a Jew would have to leave the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey. He would have to leave the promised land because of disobedience and famine in the land and have to go to the Gentiles to find food to eat. Tragic, tragic truth. When did these events take place? Let me offer this. A lot of people, I'm not alone here, many people think that the book of Ruth takes place during the time of Gideon, the judge named Gideon, and I'll tell you why. Look what it says in Judges chapter 6, verse 3 and 4. It says, "For it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites would come up with the Amalekites and the sons of the east and go against Israel." The Midianites are the bad guys. They're the nation, the Gentile nation that God raised up to oppress Israel because Israel was disobeying Him, and this is what they would do. Remember, there's a famine in the land. That's how this story starts. There's no food in the days of Ruth. Could it have been during this time? Look at what the Midianites would do when they came into Israel. They would camp against Israel and destroy the produce of the earth as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance in Israel, as well as no sheep, no ox, and no donkey. That's called famine. It's not that the crops weren't growing. It's that the Amalekites and the Midianites were coming into Israel. Remember, the very next verse says they came in like locusts and they destroyed the crops of Israel. They took it all. They stole it. So Israel didn't have anything to eat. They were in famine. So Ruth possibly, this is possibly, but I believe it's to be true, took place during this time, which is when Gideon, the one who put out the fleece, the one who, if your soldiers lap water like a dog, then pick those who destroyed the king of Midian with 300 Israeli soldiers. Gideon, I think, is when the book of Ruth takes place. Judges chapter 6 area. We need some background info about this time in history to make Ruth make more and more sense as we go through it. What was the spiritual condition like in Israel? Ruth is part of the remnant. She's a wonderful Moabite woman. Boaz is a wonderful Jewish man. What was taking place in Israel? I take you back to the very same chapter, Judges chapter 6, verse 1. The question is, what was Israel's spiritual condition? What was their relationship with God? In Judges 6:1, this is what it was. It says, "Then the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years." So for 7 years, these Midianites and the Amalekites and the sons of the east, for 7 years, every year at harvest times, they would come into Israel and strip Israel of all its produce. They'd leave nothing. There was no food to eat. They'd take the ox, they'd take the camels, they'd take the donkeys. There was nothing to eat. Or the sheep, not camels. The sheep, the ox, and the donkey. What was Israel doing that was evil in the sight of the Lord? I take you to the life of Gideon. Look here, Judges chapter 6, verse 1. Israel is doing evil in the sight of Yahweh, and Yahweh appears to this man Gideon. In Judges chapter 6, verse 25, it says, "Now on the same night, Yahweh said to Gideon, 'Take your father's bull and a second bull 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal which belongs to your father.'" You see the problem? Even Gideon's own father was idolatrous, had this altar made to the false god Baal. God also tells him, "And cut down the Asherah that is beside it." Remember, the Asherah is this carving of a tree of a woman, usually with well-endowed woman, let's say. You could tell she's a woman. And Asherah would always be set beside the altar of Baal because he was the male figure and she was his female counterpart. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But God tells Gideon, "You people are idolaters." And I want you to take a stand for me, for Yahweh, the one true God. I want you to go into your father's backyard and tear down his idolatrous altar and his idolatrous pole, his Asherah pole that he worships. That's what's going on in Israel during the time that Ruth exists and Boaz exists. Build an altar instead of the altar to Baal and the Asherah pole. Build an altar to me, to Yahweh your God. Not the false gods of Canaan, but to me. Build it on top of this stronghold in an orderly manner, and take a second bull and offer a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah, which you shall cut down. So God not only wants him to destroy the altar, he wants him to chop up the Asherah pole. It's wooden, it's carved, and use it for fire to make a proper offering to me, on a proper altar to me. That's what's going on in Israel. So, bottom line, Israel had abandoned worshiping Yahweh only and were worshiping a host of false gods, including Baal and Asherah, their favorites. That's what's going on when Ruth takes place. You read the book of Ruth and everything seems so wonderful except for the famine, and you peel back a layer and say, man, Israel was horrible then. But was Boaz horrible? Nope. An honorable, faithful, loyal servant of Yahweh, the one true God. That was also going on in Israel. The remnant was alive and well. Judges 6, verse 29 and 30, just a few verses later. After Gideon does this for Yahweh, he tears down the idolatrous altar to Baal, and he chops down the Asherah pole, and he burns the wood and makes an offering to God. The people of the town wake up and they said to one another, who did this thing? And when they searched about and inquired, they said, Gideon, the son of Joash, did this thing. And the men of the city said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die. They're protecting the false gods instead of worshiping. Finally, someone had the guts to stand up and get us back on a proper path. This Gideon, who's worshiping Yahweh again, the Jews say that man needs to die because he tore down the altar of Baal. And indeed, he has cut down the Asherah, which was beside it. Here, I have a word. I just want to talk about this for just a minute. I don't know that I've ever laid this out. Probably, but I don't know. Have you ever noticed that altars to Baal and Asherah poles are always beside each other? Whenever you read about Baal, you'll read about Asherah. They're almost always in the same verse. The altar of Baal and the Asherah poles. Very close to one another. Ever wonder why? Baal was believed by the people that worshipped him. Baal was believed to be the owner of the land, the owner of the earth. Now, keep listening to this. Baal was believed to be the owner of the land, and then because he's the owner, he was in control of the land's fertility, of all the land's fertility. Asherah was Baal's female counterpart. He was part control of the fertility. Asherah was the female that was in charge of fertility. And here comes the twist. The two are always seen together because people believe that Baal and Asherah engaged in sexual intercourse. Listen to how depraved the pagan worship was. They believed that Baal and Asherah engaged in sexual intercourse with each other, these two gods, and that is what controlled fertility on earth. The more they did what they did, the more the crops would grow. The more they did what they do, I'm talking about the intercourse between the two of them. The more they did what they did, the more rain would come, the more crops would grow, the more animal pregnancies, the more human pregnancies. They believed that Baal and Asherah were the gods of fertility, the gods of rain, the god of the crops. And that's also why you see these two so close together in pagan worship sites. They didn't just, it's just so depraved. It's just so depraved. They didn't only believe this to be true about how they engaged in wherever they were thought to live, but this is how the pagans would worship them. If Baal and Asherah have to have sexual intercourse in order for us to be fertile, then doesn't it make sense to properly worship them? What do we need to be doing? Doing the same. And that's why when you read through the Old Testament, you have all these cult prostitutes. That's why the word prostitute, harlot, is such an important word in the Old Testament, because the pagans were worshiping their gods through sex. Do you think that if a religion offered sex as the type of worship, that they would be a pretty full church today? That's what was going on in these days. That's why Baal and Asherah are always together. That's why the Baal altar and the Asherah poles are always side by side in the Old Testament, because you got to keep them close, because they've got to have sex or the crops won't grow. And like I said, of course, if you wanted to properly worship the sex-crazed false gods, you had to worship in sex-crazed ways. And Israel, especially the Jewish men, were suckers for this. They were suckers for it. They had no problem adopting this form of worship. And you'd think, how can people be so depraved? They just can. Satan has always dangled sex to destroy the worship of God. Judges 6:32, just an aside there about Baal and Asherah. This is the lifestyle in Israel during the days that Boaz lived. Now I say that because so I can make this statement. This, what I just described to you, I just didn't say it because it had sex in it. It's a lot of fun to talk about sex. I said that because the nation Israel was absolutely depraved, sunk in every sexual sin you could imagine. Yet it was still possible for Boaz to be a loyal, faithful servant of God. Now let's bring that into today's society. We live in an absolutely sex-crazed, sex-filled, aberrant sexual, deviant sexual time. Yes or no? Remember a week ago or so, Ann raised her hand and said, "Rick, can I say something?" And she made the public service announcement that if you haven't seen the movie The Sound of Freedom, you need to go see it. I saw that movie yesterday. And it was astounding. And you think, how can people be so depraved? And it almost always is the dangling of sex. And it was the same thing. You think, why would Satan come up with something new if sex has worked for 6,000 years? Why would he come up with something new? He destroys societies this way. But at the same time, even though we live in this sex-drenched world, we do not have to bow to that. We don't have to worship the god of sex. We can be loyal, faithful, remnant Christians and do things right and be lights in this dark world. And that's exactly, Christian, what we're called to do. Just like Ruth was, just like Boaz was. Stand up, rise above your culture, make the choice to represent God on this earth. Doesn't matter when you live. We could be in the pages of Ruth because Ruth lived in these days that are exactly like the horrific days we live in. Same thing. And then you have the story of Ruth and you read, how could this be? The world must have just been a simpler, lovelier place then. I'm telling you all these things because as we go through the book of Ruth, I want you to know this woman and this man stood up against the wiles of the devil in a time when everybody was bowing the knee to the sex-crazed false gods, Baal and Asherah. They wouldn't do it. Honorable men, honorable women exist even when the world is going crazy. Join me in being part of the Christian remnant. I know you are. You got to fight for it. Judges 6:32, what did they do? What did the men of Israel want to take Gideon out and kill him? And Gideon's father rose up the next day. He said, therefore on that day he named him Yerubbaal, because Gideon had the guts to fight Baal and to tear down his altar because he stood up for God. And his father said, let Baal contend against him. You men stand down. You're here to defend your God, but if he's a real God, let him take up this fight with my son. And so the act that Gideon did that night before in tearing down his father's altar and burning the Asherah pole to make a proper sacrifice to Yahweh got his dad's attention. Snapped him out of it. The next morning he says, let the false god Baal contend against him. Named his son Yerubbaal. He contends with Baal. What a man. What a fierce man Gideon was for doing that. A certain man of Bethlehem, if you look, just a couple more thoughts and we're going to close. Got a lot to talk about in Ruth. It's just hard to get into a book without building the backdrop. You have to set the stage. A certain man of Bethlehem of Judah. Remember the promise in Genesis 49:10? The scepter shall not depart from where? From Judah. This is a story of how God preserved the lineage, the promise of that Judah, that tribe of Judah being the kings. A certain man of Judah. Remember in the book of Judges, in the period in which we're talking about, when all these horrible things, Gideon is doing these things with Baal, when all this is taking place in Israel, there was no king. Yahweh, God, was to be the king of Israel. And from time to time, Yahweh would raise up a judge. But there was no king. But there will be a human king in Israel soon. And the Messiah will come through the royal family. So the book of Ruth, this wonderful story of Ruth, her story of faithfulness and loyalty, and the kinsman redeemer Boaz, we'll talk all about that, is all wonderful. But the most important thing that this book teaches us is the family tree of our Messiah, Jesus Christ. We get to trace him. And we've already known of all the lousy people, even Judah himself, Jacob's son Judah, lousy. If you remember the story from Genesis, who he was, Judah. Not a great guy. But we finally get to see these people in the line of Jesus Christ who were worshipers of Yahweh. I love this story for that. You see, I've told you so many of the kings of Judah that had Davidic blood, that were in the line of Judah and then would be in the line of Jesus Christ. So many of them were horrible kings, ungodly pagan kings. But not today. Today what we get to see is this remnant, this wonderful man Boaz, and this wonderful woman Ruth, standing up for Yahweh, worshiping Yahweh, making decisions in a very, very hard time on earth when it was horribly unpopular to worship God, the one true God, Yahweh. Ruth and Boaz, that's exactly what they did. It's a wonderful story. Let's just stop. We'll pick up there next time. Trust me, this isn't going to take forever, but I know that you'll enjoy the book of Ruth. These 4 chapters are wonderful. Read ahead. Have questions. We learn a lot about a lot in the book of Ruth. Let's close in prayer.